It really does. I promise it does. So firstly, hello. I'm Mark. It's great to see so many talented martial artists here today, many of whom I have the pleasure of training with or training under, so great that you guys showed up. Doesn't make me feel nervous at all. So training in the martial arts, you encounter problems all the time. You know, you kind of start off and you're like, man, surely everyone can be a pro kickboxer in a year, right? And then you get a year in, you're like, man, I am really far away from where I was planning to be right now. And so you're constantly hitting these roadblocks. You're trying to figure out, like, am I ever going to be good at this? Are there things that I need to work on? Like, what am I doing here? And I encounter these problems all the time with people that I train with. I have a friend right now who's trying to balance personal issues with injuries, with recovery time, with training, you know, this constant battle that we face of making sure that we're putting in enough time, we're showing our commitment, and we're ultimately achieving goals that we set out for ourselves. This is a very, very challenging problem, but there is a solution. It's a really, really straightforward solution. You may not have thought of it. It's making video games. Making video games is a very complex problem. It's something that is way more complex than you might think. Hundreds of people work on video game teams across multiple disciplines. You have animators, you have designers, you have engineers, you have project managers, finance directors, executives, all of whom want to get something different out of that project. A video game will take 3 to 5 years to make. That's a long time. It's a big investment of hundreds of millions of dollars for some games. So you have to get it right. You can't build a product and just kind of hope that at the end of it, like, it's the right thing for people. So you're constantly thinking about how to iterate. But first, before I go into too much detail on video games, let me tell you a bit about myself and how I got there. So I grew up in the UK, much like Paul McCarthy over there. But unlike Paul McCarthy, I really embraced the drizzle, which for people who live in LA, by the way, is a condition where water falls out of the sky. I stayed inside. I ate the brown or green food that my mother served to me every day with our fantastic cuisine over there. And from that, I kind of took up an interest in video games, being indoors quite a lot of the time. And happily, I've been able to turn that into a career. Thankfully, later in life, I discovered martial arts, which is a very good thing for me with my corpulent frame. But as I kind of started to work in video games, I realized that there's actually a huge parallel between how you build something that's incredibly complex with many different people, many different stakeholders, many different asks of you. And, you know, the complexity of going into training. You know, I train in multiple systems, which can get very confusing. You can feel like, man, am I doing too much? You know, am I thinking about kickboxing and grappling and all of the different weapon arts that I'm doing? Am I doing too much? Am I spreading myself too thin? How am I kind of going to progress in each of these things all at the same time, which is a very similar problem. So going back to making video games then. So when you make a video game, it's kind of like eating an elephant, right? You've got a huge problem in front of you. How do you solve it? If you try and eat an elephant all at once, it's not a very good idea. You generally want to break it down into pieces. You want to understand the problem that you're facing, break it down into smaller pieces. In a video game company, a team working on one problem over that 3 to 5 year period might be 10 to 15 people of different disciplines. Those 10 to 15 people are going to take, you know, a couple of those pieces, and they're going to start working on those pieces as you go through. It's really important that those guys understand the context of both the wider problem that they're trying to solve and the smaller piece that they have and how that fits into the overall problem. And one of the things that we find in video games is we may set out to make a game at the very beginning with a specific problem that we want to solve in mind. But at the end, when we actually solve that problem, it may look very, very different. You never really want to be in a situation where you're a fully funded studio, you're making a game, you fully believe in it, you've been working on these animations, they're beautiful, you've really put your life and soul into it, and then Barbie Horse Adventures, your life's work, launches right next to Call of Duty, and suddenly, like, you know, the studio has to close. It just happens. It happens all the time in gaming. And the way we solve for that is those smaller pieces, as we develop them and as we start putting them into the overall puzzle that we're trying to solve, we start to look at what's working, what's not. We start to test. We start to understand, like, are people liking this? Are people enjoying what we're delivering here? And it's really, really critical that we get that feedback early. We want to fail fast, and we want to fail often. We never want to get to the point where we get to the end of that 3 to 5 year development window, and suddenly we realize we've developed the wrong product. We've spent a ton of money. We're going to have to lay people off. We want to early and often know and be able to change the decisions that we're making and pivot when we can. So breaking that elephant down into pieces is really, really important. Now, let's say that we, rather than eating the elephant, we're going to use that analogy and we're going to build an elephant. And we've got a very specific goal in mind as we build this elephant. So everyone in the team, everyone hopefully in the room, knows what an elephant is. Now, we have a specific goal for what we want this elephant to do in the video game that I'm now going to pitch you. We want this elephant to actually be the hero of the game. We want to be solving a problem across the savannah where there's too many lions. We need to solve the lion problem. Now, an elephant might not be the most obvious thing, but you know, the testing that we've done, we understand that elephants are very popular amongst the audience that we're looking at. We've got an artist who specializes in elephants. We really want to use his skills. So the elephant we may end up building may be very, very different by the end of the project, the one that you all have in your mind right now. To be able to solve that problem, he may end up with more tusks. He might be purple. He might have wings. He might breathe fire. These are just some of the things that we might do, and it may not even at the end of it be called technically an elephant. Now, this isn't just my pitch for Trunk Dragon, Devourer of the Pride. This is actually something where we see incremental improvement as we work through a project. By breaking those issues down into smaller things, by giving ourselves smaller and smaller goals, we're able to really understand the progress that we're making immediately. We can make those changes quickly. We can make those changes often. And we never really see failure as a binary thing. And in education, that's a big problem. In education, you get your pass or your fail. That's it. There's not really a kind of linear progression there. It's very difficult to get into the growth mindset that we were talking about earlier in terms of understanding that there's still places you can go, there's still changes you can make, there's still things you can do. Yet on the path to, say, a big test, you may go through those increments, but because you only see that pass and fail at the end, it's very difficult to understand that those increments are kind of what play into that. So in gaming, we really try and break those problems down. We try and understand where we're failing really, really early. We try and fail as often as possible, and we really look at failure as a tool to help us succeed. It's not a stopping point. It's not something we worry about. We certainly don't attribute blame to anybody. We're very much focused on how we make things better. So, going back to martial arts. So taking the problem that I was talking about earlier in terms of my friend who's kind of having trouble balancing each aspect of their life and bringing that into their training, it's really critical that they understand those components so they can actually see, wow, I made progress here. I've done this, I've done that. But also, you know, these are the areas where I need to start compromising. I need to start prioritizing. I need to think really with an open mindset about the problems I want to solve and how I want to solve them and when I want to solve them. Learning really doesn't have a peak. There's no point at which you're like, I'm plateauing now, I can't learn anymore. And I think that's something that in video games we really embrace. We're changing a product right up to the day before launch. We're as focused on kind of making that window as small as possible and really making as many decisions as often as we can. So in martial arts, one of the problems that I have, for example, is I ask too many questions. Man, I ask too many questions. One of my instructors is up there. He definitely knows that. And the reason that I do that, I realized is, man, I'm not actually thinking about the technique that I want to solve right now. I'm not trying to just get that technique done. I'm not trying to then improve and work on that technique. I'm actually just trying to get ahead of solving that problem and really ask the questions and kind of not really necessarily get the technique in the first place. So again, thinking about that with more of an open mindset and less of a fixed mindset, it allows me to attack that problem differently and think about, no, I'm gonna nail this technique once or twice. I'm gonna get what they want down, and then I'm gonna expand on it and start asking those questions and really start to understand the technique more. This applies to so many things, not just martial arts. Really breaking down problems and understanding how you can take those smaller pieces. But I will leave you with a quote, which incidentally is one of my failures today, is learning never to put quotes in these things, because then you actually have to remember it. But the quote is from Bruce Lee, and he said, "Learning is never cumulative. It is a movement of knowing which has no beginning and no end." Thank you.